In seeking knowledge beyond mortal bounds, I discovered too late that some doors, once opened, become mirrors, reflecting not what we wish to find, but what has already found us. The book was never a door to other worlds. We were always on the other side, waiting to realize it. The tome didn't reveal secrets. It revealed our place in them. We are not the readers of forbidden knowledge, but rather its punctuation marks, scattered between volumes of infinite horror. The leather-bound tome sits heavy in my hands as thunder rattles the windows of my Providence apartment. Strange how a book can carry such weight beyond its physical mass. I adjust my round spectacles, watching raindrops trace chaotic patterns on the glass, much like the shadows I witnessed that night in Brown University's Riston Quadrangle. June 6th, 1986. The day began with unprecedented warmth, the kind that makes even New England feel tropical. By evening, dark clouds had gathered with unnatural speed, forming shapes that defied meteorological explanation. From my position in Room 5, I had a perfect view of the horror that would unfold in Room 6. Marcus and David were typical engineering students, Marcus with his perpetual calculator, David with his radio equipment. The whispers started at 6:06 p.m. At first, I thought it was their usual technical banter, but the sounds, they slithered under my door like living things, accompanied by ribbons of phosphorescent light that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The scratching came next. Not the familiar sound of pencils on paper, but something organic, as if reality itself was being carved away. Shadows writhed in that narrow space between door and floor, casting shapes that hurt my eyes to perceive. I heard Marcus scream something about coordinates and impossible angles, while David's voice became increasingly hysterical about signals from nowhere.
Coordinates, impossible angles!
Signals from nowhere.
When campus security finally broke down their door at midnight, Room 6 was empty. No signs of struggle, no evidence of departure. Only Marcus's calculator displaying repeating sixes, and David's radio emitting a frequency that made the security officer's nose bleed. 3 weeks passed in a blur of police interviews and administrative meetings. Each night I'd wake at precisely 3:33 a.m., my room filled with a low humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The temperature would drop suddenly, forming delicate patterns of frost on my window that resembled ancient symbols I'd later find within the book's pages. Then came that final night. I returned from the library at dusk, the corridor to my room darker than usual despite the flickering fluorescent lights. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, and my footsteps echoed with a delay that suggested impossible acoustics. As I approached my door, I noticed a peculiar distortion in the space before it, as if reality was folding in on itself, creating a pocket of absolute darkness. There, suspended in that void, was the book. It didn't fall when the darkness receded. It simply remained, hovering at chest height, oriented perfectly perpendicular to the floor, in defiance of gravity. No string or support held it in place. As I reached for it, my fingers brushed against something cold and wet, like dew on morning grass. Yet the cover was completely dry when I finally grasped it. The book remained untouched on my desk for 3 days, its presence commanding attention like a black hole in my peripheral vision. The inscription at its center seemed to shift when viewed directly, yet remained perfectly clear in reflective surfaces. Using my drafting tools, I carefully traced the overlapping symbols onto tracing paper, my hands trembling as I completed each line. Dr. Burnett Shaw, Chair of Near Eastern Studies, examined my tracing with growing concern. These sigils? They're pre-Islamic, possibly Nabatean in origin, but the arrangement... She pulled off her glasses, polishing them vigorously. Check Wolfson's Symbols of the Ancient Near East, 3rd floor, Eastern Stacks, page 187, might interest you. The library's 3rd floor was unusually cold that afternoon. Wolfson's tome, thick with dust, fell open easily to page 187, too easily, as if frequently consulted. There in faded ink, I found it, a partial match to my tracing. The text described a hexagrammic seal of binding used in volumes of forbidden knowledge. The citation led to another source, On the Origins of the Necronomicon, by Lanfer. The temperature seemed to drop further as I read about Abdul al-Hazred, the mad Arab who spent 10 years in the empty quarter of Arabian desert. He emerged with the Necronomicon, his masterwork of cosmic horror and forbidden knowledge. The 6 overlapping symbols I'd traced matched his personal seal, a warning mark found only on authentic copies of his cursed manuscript. The next passage chilled me more than the library's unnatural cold. Al-Hazred's final days in Damascus were marked by public ravings about watching eyes and crimson thresholds. He was last seen in broad daylight, being torn apart by invisible forces while screaming that they had found him. No trace of his body was ever recovered. The book waiting in my room now had a history, a context that made its presence even more terrifying. As I closed Wolfson's volume, I noticed frost forming on its leather binding, the same pattern of symbols that had appeared on my window that first night. In that most baleful week following the disappearance, I observed with mounting disquiet the methodical dismantling of Room 6's mysteries. First came the authorities, their garish yellow tape a mockery of containment for forces beyond mortal comprehension. When at last they conceded defeat in their mundane investigation, the university dispatched its custodial servants to excise all evidence of Marcus and David's dwelling. From my vigil in Room 5, I watched these blue-clad functionaries go about their grim task with horrifying normalcy, speaking of trivial matters while they sealed away items that had witnessed untold cosmic horrors. Their casual discourse about sporting events and weather forecasts seemed a grotesque counterpoint to the eldritch patterns still visible in the scorch marks upon the walls. When at last they departed for their midday repast, leaving the door momentarily unsealed, I seized upon this opportunity with trembling resolve. The room retained its peculiar geometries, angles that seemed to bend when viewed directly, yet remained stubbornly wrong in one's peripheral vision. Here lay Marcus's precisely organized desk, his calculator still displaying that maddening sequence of sixes. There David's radio equipment sat silent, though I could swear the dials moved fractionally of their own accord. In a cardboard repository of Marcus's effects, beneath volumes of differential equations and thermodynamic principles, I discovered an artifact that caused my blood to run cold. A business card, its edges charred as if by otherworldly flames. Antiquarian oddities and rarities, it proclaimed in an aristocratic script, bearing an address in dreaded Olneyville, some 20 miles hence. The voices that had plagued my nights grew more insistent as I pocketed this damning evidence. They whispered in tones that brought to mind both the sweetest pleasures and the most unspeakable horrors, their promises growing more seductive with each passing moment. Yet I dared not touch the accursed tome that still waited on my desk. Its leather-bound horror, a constant reminder of my friend's fate. With the traced inscriptions secure in my coat pocket, I resolved to seek out this establishment, though every fiber of my being screamed against further investigation into these matters beyond mortal ken. The drive to Olneyville lay before me, 20 miles of normalcy before I would confront whatever truth awaited regarding the book's sinister path to Room 6. The antiquarian shop's atmosphere assaulted my senses with an archaic melange. Aged leather and burning sage intermingled with subtler, more unspeakable fragrances that defied earthly categorization. Behind a counter of age-darkened oak stood a young woman whose dark hair framed features marked by knowledge no mortal should possess. A silver pendant at her throat pulsed with an ethereal azure luminescence that seemed to respond to unseen forces. "Pépère's last trick," she sighed, her accent softening slightly on the French endearment. Her fingers traced the symbols with a familiarity born of watching him do the same countless times. He'd held that cursed book for 40 years. It drained him, aged him decades beyond his years, when your friends came looking for rare books. She shook her head. He saw his chance. Her fingers traced the edge of a daguerreotype in a tarnished frame. He passed away 2 weeks after giving them the book. Maman said she'd never seen him so at peace in those final days, as if some great weight had lifted. Whether it was the book's influence or the forces behind it, he seemed happy, truly happy, for the first time in decades. They found him in his favorite chair one morning, that old volume of Baudelaire still open on his lap, a serene smile upon features that had known only torment for so long. From beneath the counter, she withdrew a leather-bound journal whose binding bore the same peculiar wear as the Necronomicon itself, its pages filled with notes in both English and French, the languages often blending as if his thoughts couldn't be contained by either tongue alone. The book can't be destroyed or discarded. It binds itself to a keeper until they either pass it on willingly or... She gestured to another photograph on the wall, an earlier image of her grandfather, his form withered beyond recognition, eyes holding the haunted look of one who had gazed too long into infinite abysses, until it consumes them completely. "Your friends?" she continued, her voice taking on resonances that seemed to echo from impossible distances. They tried using it, didn't they? Opened it, read from it. Her fingers traced protective symbols in the air, leaving momentary afterimages that seared themselves into my vision. The book doesn't just contain knowledge, it's a beacon. Reading it draws their attention. Opening it invites them in. With each subsequent visit to that curious establishment, Miss Catherine Blackwood, for that was her name, revealed fragments of Pépère's 4-decade struggle with the Necronomicon. Her initial wariness transmuted into scholarly fascination upon discovering my background in comparative literature and ancient languages, fields of study that, I would learn, had barely scratched the surface of true cosmic understanding. Most succumb to its whispers within days, she observed, carefully transcribing protective sigils from Pépère's journal into patterns that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally. Yet you've resisted opening it for weeks. More importantly, you seek to understand it rather than use it. Over bitter cups of Maxwell House, that most mundane anchor to our reality, amid towering shelves of arcane texts whose spines bore titles in languages long dead to mortal tongues, we pieced together the tome's Eldritch Principles. The book, she explained, operated on a principle of psychic resonance. It responded to its keeper's intentions with an almost sentient malevolence. Those who sought power invariably found themselves consumed by it, their very essence absorbed into realms beyond human comprehension. But those who approached it with scholarly detachment might survive. Pépère maintained his sanity through rigorous documentation, she explained, showing me pages where elegant French script gradually gave way to more disturbing annotations. The book, it respected his scholarly approach in its own way, yet I could see the toll such knowledge extracted. Catherine's hands trembled slightly when handling certain texts, and sometimes her eyes would dart to shadows that seemed to move against the natural flow of light. She was tied to this legacy as surely as I was now bound to the book, both of us caught in an orbit around forces vast beyond mortal reckoning. "I'll help you understand it," she finally offered one evening, her silver pendant pulsing with an intensity that cast strange geometries across the shop's ancient woodwork. Not out of pity, but because you might succeed where Pépère failed, finding a way to study it without being devoured by it. But first, we need to establish proper wards. The tome shuddered on the oak table, surrounded by Catherine's protective sigils drawn in chalk that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight. We had barely settled into our research when the ancient leather binding creaked with a sound like distant screams, its pages rustling as if stirred by winds from another dimension. The book fell open with unnatural precision, its yellowed pages settling on what appeared to be a handwritten account. Catherine's pendant flared with an azure brilliance that momentarily transfigured her features into something otherworldly. "It wants us to read this," she whispered, her scholarly composure fracturing before forces beyond her control. "The book has never done this before." Her fingers hovered over the text without touching it, as if the very ink might burn. "Look, Clint Arnold. This is different from Pépère's notes. It's as if it's choosing to reveal itself," I finished, watching the text seem to sharpen into focus beneath the candlelight, each letter bearing a clarity that felt somehow wrong, as if written in dimensions beyond our own. "The forces behind it," she said, checking the protective wards which now seemed to pulse with their own inner light. They're testing us, showing us what happens to those who approach the book without preparation. She met my eyes with a gaze that held both terror and fascination. We should read it, together. The book, it's offering us a lesson. The pages seemed to pulse with a subtle luminescence as we leaned forward. The account of Clint Arnold lying before us like a confession waiting to be heard. Even through the chalk barriers, I could feel the book's satisfaction, or perhaps anticipation, as we began to read. In the depths of my despair, I, Clint Arnold, committed an act of such profound foolishness that I must now record it, lest my sanity completely abandon me. My beloved Clara, claimed by the ravaging consumption in that accursed winter of 1822, 6 days before the Yuletide festivities she so cherished. What should have marked our 6th year of matrimonial bliss instead became an epoch of unrelenting grief, where naught but the black garments of mourning and the lamentations of her kin, her parents, brothers, and youngest sister, echoed through the interminable days. In my mounting delirium, I found myself awaiting her return, as though she had merely departed for one of her customary sojourns with her siblings, expecting at any moment to hear the approaching carriage bearing her home, along with those peculiar delicacies her mother so masterfully prepared, such quotidian comforts that now seemed to belong to some distant, half-remembered realm. But now I'm left a hollow shell, haunting the shadowed corridors of our Charleston estate, where the very silence of her absence has transformed into a maddening drone that drove me to seek solace in ancient texts, those forbidden tomes that whispered of thresholds between worlds. The ritual seemed deceptively simple, circles drawn in blood, candles arranged in patterns that hurt the eye, and words that felt like shards of glass in my throat. As I completed the final incantation, the darkness before me parted like a velvet curtain, revealing nothing but a pair of luminous crimson lips floating in the void. "Clara," I whispered, my voice trembling with a desperate hope that now seems foolishly naive. "My love, is it truly you?" The lips curved into a smile that seemed both tender and terrible. "Remember the garden, Clint?" came the response, soft and achingly familiar. "The roses you planted for our anniversary, how the thorns pricked your fingers, but you wouldn't stop until every bush achieved perfection." My heart clenched at the memory, each beat a thunderous reminder of my solitude. "The white roses. You said they reminded you of your mother's garden. And the lullaby you'd sing to me during storms," the voice continued, weaving through my memories like poisoned silk. "The one your grandmother taught you. Sing it with me, darling." Tears streamed down my face as the entity began humming the forgotten melody, each note a dagger of remembrance. "How could you know that?" "We never told anyone about." "Because I am your Clara. Remember the secret we shared that midsummer night? The wish we made together." I stepped closer, my resolve crumbling like ancient parchment. "Under the elder tree, we buried the silver locket with our pictures," the voice finished. 3 feet deep, marked with a river stone. No one else could know that, Clint. No one but me. I approached the circle's edge, drawn by an inexorable force. "I've missed you so terribly. The house is a sepulchre without your laughter. Please, step into the light where I can see you properly." "The light pains my eyes now, darling," the voice purred with an otherworldly resonance. "Come closer to me, into the shadows. Here, I can embrace you as I once did." "But I need to see your face," I pleaded, stretching my hand toward the impenetrable darkness. Show me your eyes, your smile, the way they used to be. A soft laugh rippled through the chamber like distant thunder. Things are different now, my love. The darkness holds such beauty once you embrace it. Take 3 steps forward. Let me show you what I've learned beyond the veil. Your voice, it's changing, I noticed, cold dread creeping up my spine like 1,000 scuttling insects. Clara never spoke of darkness. She loved the morning sun. Enough! The voice suddenly thundered, patience shattering like crystalline glass. The crimson lips contorted in fury, and behind them the darkness peeled away like burning paper. What revealed itself seared itself into my sanity, a vast impossible visage that filled my entire field of vision. What I first took for a forehead was a writhing mass of human eyes, hundreds, thousands of them, all blinking in unsynchronized horror. Then I saw them, Eli's eyes, my childhood friend's familiar green irises staring back at me from that cosmic nightmare. The truth of his fate crashed through my mind like a tidal wave of perpetual madness. The official story, that poor Eli had gouged out his own eyes in grief over his wife's death, was a convenient fiction. Now I knew what truly happened to the man who had given me the book of incantations, who had disappeared after his own desperate attempt to pierce the veil. Your friend was more willing to see the truth, the entity boomed, its voice now a chorus of screams that seemed to echo from the depths of time itself. He gave himself to the void so completely. The thing that wore Clara's voice began to speak of impossible geometries, of cities that existed in dimensions beyond human comprehension. Each word felt like a nail being driven into my skull, and I realized with mounting horror that what I had summoned was not my beloved wife, but something that had been waiting eons for fools like me to open doors that should remain forever sealed. In my terror, my eyes fell upon the ritual page, and there I saw what I had overlooked, an inscription in ancient blood. Life and chaos are like oil in water, separated by the blood soaked into the ground. Below it, a date from 3 centuries past. The meaning struck me with terrible clarity. The circle of blood was a barrier, a last defense against the chaos beyond. The entity's crimson lips curved into an amused smile. Ah, you've found the warning. Yes, little one, you're safe within your circle. Such mortal concepts you cling to. Its laughter rippled through dimensions. But you fail to understand. The ritual was never a door. It was a threshold. The moment you spoke those words, you crossed from your realm into mine. Your circle exists in the void now. Time means nothing here. I can wait until hunger, thirst, or madness drives you beyond its bounds. And so I write these words in Eli's book, my hands trembling, my throat parched with an unnatural thirst that seems to transcend mere mortal need. To you who finds this tome, heed the warning written in blood 3 centuries past. Some boundaries once crossed allow no return, and some knowledge once gained becomes a prison more terrible than any earthly confine.